Okay, I'm going to pick up with Chapter 4 for your U.S. Survey class on page 393. Just as a reminder, please do keep in mind that we are not, or I am not lecturing in completion as far as make sure you read, is what I'm getting at. Make sure that you're not just assuming I'm giving you everything. I'm just trying to gloss over it so that you have some sort of voice in your head pointing out where things are and hopefully helping you as you get ready for your test. As we start out on page 393, this particular chapter focuses on the end of the war and Wilson's role in that. As I mentioned from the intro, he came in with a lot of ideas, which I mentioned you need to know the 14 points. This is imperative to what he plans to see happen at the end of the war, not the least of which are his goals of how to deal with it. He's going to have to look at what caused it. And so he comes up with 5 points as far as how does this begin. And this is what's going to lay out his plan for the first 5 points of his 14 points. So the first one, your book tells you he wants to end secret diplomacy. He says that all of these secret alliances, this was a big part of it. We need to be open and honest in our communication, and everybody should know these two countries are tightly aligned economically as well as militaristically. He also says that we need to promote and support the freedom of the seas. This was such a large part of why we got involved in the war. It's certainly a large part of the war in general. Number 3, he says we need to remove trade barriers and restrictive tariffs. And this is as much on us as Americans as it is on everybody else. Number 4, he says there needs to be an overall arms reduction. Of course, as you might imagine, even today, when a particular president says we need to reduce the number of arms we hold, most people are going to balk at it. But it's meant to be a larger picture, not just we'll do it if you do it. It's meant that we will all do it. Number 5 was an end to what we would call imperialism. No more of this colonizing nations and fighting to keep up with the Joneses, so to speak. I don't know if that's a Southern colloquialism. The rest of the 14 points are essentially about these countries that have been absorbed into another. It's going to remap Europe, and it talks about reestablishing these political boundaries. Now, the unfortunate part, and we'll see this when we actually get into the war room where they're deciding what the treaty looks like, they don't really take into account cultures. They're looking for the nearest river to cut this particular country off. Does that make sense? Kind of picture it in your topography. Maybe that helps out a little bit. But his greatest point, and that's the last one, is what he calls the League of Nations. And in a very brief way, I guess it's the world police, where he's basically saying we're going to keep each other in check. We're going to make sure that we are going to stay true to our goals of a warless world. Now, not to get too deep into it, but the League of Nations, there's a number of reasons this does not end up working, not the least of which is you have to have complete buy-in, and it's kind of unclear. What does an aggressor nation look like? Who gets to decide? And it has to be unanimous if they're going to take action. What does that action look like? There's a lot of loopholes that essentially allow it to fail. So do make sure you know League of Nations. And then, of course, I already mentioned Armistice Day, and they go to meet these important dignitaries that are going to decide the fate of particularly Germany. They go to meet at the castle at Versailles, which is in France. And that's on page 395. You need to know that. By this point, the other dignitaries have heard Wilson's plan for peace. For the most part, they're not interested. As I mentioned in the earlier video, a lot of these dignitaries are angry. They have been decimated by the war, and so they are distracted and frustrated by the fact that Wilson's proposing just, okay, it's over, let's be done with it, where these other countries want some sort of retribution for the damages caused to them. There are what we call the Big Four, and you want to make sure you know the Big Four. Of these people, you certainly have David Lloyd George, who is British. He is the Prime Minister. Make sure you know him. You also want to know George Clemenceau. He's the French Premier. You also want to know Vittorio Orlando. He is the Italian leader. It's kind of weird that he's here at all. He does come out a victor, so to speak, but his role is very minor. And then, of course, you have Wilson. This is important because all four of these countries have different agendas. The truth of the matter, though, is three of the four are much more angry and bitter about it and want to see true repayment of the war debt that's been caused, where Wilson is not in that group. He has quite a dilemma, and he knows that Wilson has to decide, what am I going to do about this? And he ends up having to settle all the way down to, as long as we get the League of Nations, then I'm okay with the rest of it. Certainly not what he wanted. But unfortunately, while he's gone working through this, back in America, he has mounting momentum against him. This is led by one Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts. Make sure you know him. He's basically telling Americans, Wilson's been gone for a long time. He'd been gone about 6 months during all of these negotiations. Number one, that's the first president to do anything like this, and number two, it's the longest a president's been away from Washington during this time period, or excuse me, up until this time period. So it's a pretty big deal. He's been gone, and Lodge ends up using this time period to basically mount opposition against him. When the treaty finally does come to Congress, you see that Lodge's efforts have worked. Wilson comes back. He goes on essentially a speaking tour where he's trying to tell Americans, we do want to pass this, but it's kind of too little too late. Most Americans, particularly those of importance in Congress, are going to basically say this is not going to work. And you can read all about that throughout that chapter. Unfortunately, on his speaking tour, Wilson ends up falling ill. He ends up suffering from a stroke that basically paralyzes him, and it makes him, I mean, this sounds really cruel, but a lame duck in his final years of presidency, which means that that treaty is never ratified by the United States, which means that we don't accept that peace, and we end up signing a separate peace with Germany during this time period, and we never join the League of Nations. So make sure you read that chapter really thoroughly. Post-war, America looks to be going through kind of a boom, and it's called the Roar of the 20s on page 401 in Chapter 5. And Chapter 5 goes through that adjustment period from post-war into a new world as far as America goes. We go back right into isolationism. We don't want anything to do with another country, certainly for the fear of war. Part of this is going to be driven not just by the war itself and not by the ramifications of the war, but my goodness, all of our soldiers come back, and most of them, not most of them, many of them are bringing with them the Spanish flu. And this is a terrible epidemic that spreads around the world. More than 22 million people die from this. And so there's even more frustration with the war. Not with our guys, thankfully. They are welcomed back with open arms. We also see in this isolationism, we see Americans kind of become radicals as far as our ideology. We're so anti-war and so anti all these things that we turn into a country that really struggles with their identity. And your book talks a little bit on page 402 about what does that identity look like. We struggle with the problem at this point of our race relations. We're seeing riots break out all over the country. We are also struggling with something called the Red Scare, and you want to know about this Red Scare, particularly Attorney General Palmer, and he's known for the Palmer raids. There is such a fear of communism infiltrating America that Palmer kind of takes up this flag of we have to stop communism in a way that's going to prove to be very interesting. Couple things I just want to point out, particularly these Palmer raids, this idea of taking major liberties with our freedoms, and basically anyone that wants to report their neighbor or not so friendly friend for being a communist, they can, and Palmer may decide he's going to raid your house and he can take you in on any number of charges and arrest you. These are a number of problems, and if you Google for me, there's there's a link, How to Spot a Communist, and essentially this is a newsreel that's run in front of a movie per se. Very brief, it's maybe just a minute, minute and a half, but it's comical to us because it seems so ludicrous, and yet this is the fear that motivates a lot of things in this movement time period. Also on page 403, you're introduced to Sacco and Vanzetti, and you want to know them for your test. These are immigrants that are accused of robbing and then murdering a paymaster in Massachusetts. This is a very difficult time in our American history. Again, there is some evidence that says that they were not involved. We don't really know the whole story, but they do finally admit to being radicals, and in that basically they've killed themselves in so many ways. So do keep in mind with that, they end up being killed by electric chair in 1927. 1921, we see the passing of the Emergency Immigration Act. This is a part of that isolationist move. We don't want to be involved in your wars, but you know what? We want to just kind of keep everything right here. As far as we are Americans, leave us alone. And so we see Americans react in this way where we're going to lower our numbers, our percentage of people that can come into the country. And by doing that, we're going to try and control who's American, who's not. And so we see a vast number of Asians and even Europeans being discriminated against because we don't want you in our country. This does allow for more Central and South Americans to come into our country. We see a massive influx of Cubans, Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, Hispanics at large coming into our country, trying to experience, as your book calls it, the land of the free and the home of the brave. We also see the second incarnation of the KKK. This is something that we really see it grow very, very fast. And they are going to target blacks, Catholics, Jews, immigrants, any foreigner at large. They're going to target, and they're going to try and basically harass them and intimidate them. And we see this being led by a guy by the name of Simmons. He's a former minister who is saying that we don't need to be that melting pot. We need to be true Americans. Thankfully, the American Congress decides that this is essentially a terrorist organization and begin making laws that are going to restrict them. When that happens, we see the Klan essentially fall in their recruitment. Their size dwindles almost immediately. It's really quite remarkable. Also notice on page 405, the flappers. You guys have heard of flappers. Who knows? Maybe you've dressed up as a flapper. Notice them for their role in culture during this time. They're known for being wearing the short skirts, cutting their hair short, wearing bright lipstick. They are seen necking and kissing in public. They're seen drinking and smoking. These are huge, huge cultural shifts during this time period. But it does represent a larger view of change in America. We also see a difference in how American writers are. You see F. Scott Fitzgerald on page 406. He wrote This Side of Paradise, where he talks, it's a fictional work, but he talks about this shift in culture. We also see a little bit more about that alcohol prohibition, what we do with that. The timing of it works out really nicely during the war because there are parts of these alcoholic beverages that can be used for food for our men abroad, but it really doesn't solve the problem at large. We are seeing that there are so many sections of the country that are still illegally producing some sort of booze, selling it, and we're seeing as much of a problem with speakeasies and other illegal functions. We also see the rise of Al Capone. Many of you are fascinated by him. You want to know Capone for your test. He is ingenious in so many ways in taking advantage of this desire, this thirst for liquor. And so he is going to basically move his illegal goods and making a killing off of him. We are the American justice system at this point isn't able to catch him in the murders and some of these other illegal activities, and they finally lock him up for tax evasion. He's making millions of dollars and not paying any taxes, and that's finally what gets him. Do make sure and read the sidebar on page 407 and 408. This talks about how culture is going to influence music. We see the rise of jazz and blues and some incredible artists during this time period. Specifically for your test, you want to know W.C. Handy as well as Bessie Smith, who's known for the Love Blue or Careless Love blues, as well as other incredible blues performances. In Chapter 6, we see a new president, and his name is Warren Gamaliel Harding. He's important because he comes in with this idea that we need to return to normalcy. This is a new word. He basically coins it for his election, and essentially what he's saying is we need to get back to just being Americans. In many ways, historians now accuse him of being a do-nothing president. He was so busy trying to be normal, whatever that means, that he isn't really accomplishing anything as far as his time in president. This works really nicely for him. Americans are tired of war. They're tired of all the nonsense that goes with it. So the idea of something calm, relaxing, and quote-unquote normal is very appealing, and he wins quite nicely. He runs with his running mate, Calvin Coolidge, who you want to know him for your test. He's his vice president who later becomes president. Now, Coolidge has a lot more experience, although he is very quiet in his nature as well. Harding described himself as this common man, but he's common in comical ways. How about that? He is, despite Prohibition, he's still a whiskey drinker, known for his bootlegging in the White House. He smoked, he chewed tobacco, played poker, had a mistress. He's normal in some unfortunate ways, I guess. He ends up running against James M. Cox, who has nominated one Franklin Roosevelt to be his vice presidential running mate, which we'll see him pop up again a little bit later on. But you need to know Cox and Roosevelt for your test. We also see them running against Eugene V. Debs, which in your reading you would have noticed him from earlier. He's a radical that lands himself in jail because of his anti-war rhetoric, but he ends up logging in almost 1 million votes. So his stance on the issues resonates with a lot of Americans. Harding's idea of return to normalcy is kind of interrupted by some pretty corrupt guys that work for him. Harding's not perfect, but he brings with him some very unsavory characters. Of these people he brings with him, not all of them are bad, don't misunderstand me, but one of them your book mentions is Andrew Mellon, who you've probably heard the name Mellon before on page 411. Make sure you know him. Kind of a tycoon, really, of industry, known for his aluminum company. He ends up coming in and pushing through some economic changes that are very profitable for the wealthy few in America. Harding doesn't get involved in this, and so Mellon really does have the opportunity to run ramshot over that. You also see Albert B. Fall, who is of those unsavory folks. Make sure you know him for your test. He ends up coming in, bringing with him some other members of Harding's old friends who are going to end up ruining, in many ways, Harding's legacy. The reason I bring up Fall specifically is because of his Teapot Dome scandal, and you want to know that for your test. Very bottom of page 411. Make sure to read about that so you can better understand it. When this scandal is kind of brought to Harding's attention, because so much of it is kept under wraps for a while, Harding is quite distraught, and he seeks the counsel of one Herbert Hoover, who at this point is the Secretary of Commerce, and asks him, if you were president, what would you do about this? And Hoover comes back with some pretty good and straightforward advice. It's found at the bottom of page 412. Publish it and at least get credit for integrity on your side. That's a pretty big deal, except for poor Harding doesn't have a chance to follow up on it. He ends up dying very quickly after a heart attack in San Francisco, where we now have a new president by the name of Calvin Coolidge. He's going to continue much of what Harding had begun, a little less corrupt, I might add, but he does come in. He's a quiet man who is very unassuming, although he is very intelligent. Your book kind of gives you a little bit of a rundown of him on page 413, but he is, again, he's very well liked because he is just this very common man. There's nothing substantial about him or really life-altering decisions that he'll make during that time period. He wins his own election after that very soundly, and the American public likes him. During this time period, we see the rise of the radio, and we see some new regulatory acts that are going to be passed to protect these people that are listening to the radio as well as radio companies. The one you want to know about for your test is KDKA. This was in Pittsburgh, and it's the first to hit the airwaves in 1920. It becomes kind of the benchmark of what becomes entertainment for American people, and it grows exponentially during this time period. When we hit the next election, this is where we see Herbert Hoover come into play, and he is going to run against Alfred E. Smith. So make sure and read all about that. As you move into Chapter 7, you can learn a little bit more about American culture during this time period, and we'll get to that in just a few minutes.